you guys, and of course, I want to thank each of these organizations for helping make it possible. You may have noticed that I chose a somewhat provocative title for this evening's little chat. I did that for two reasons. One is because I'm not an academic, I'm a journalist, and I'm a journalist in the age of Slate and BuzzFeed. So that was as close as I could get to a provocative title without, something, and you will never believe what happens next. So consider that sort of the real life version of clickbait. And secondly, because despite it being in a glib fashion, it gets to the heart of some of the things that we're going to talk about tonight. So I'm going to chat for a little bit, and then we'll open it up for you to pursue the conversation with questions, or if you'd like to denounce me as an instrument of the patriarchy, you're more than welcome to do that as well. So first I want to start with talking a little bit about sort of current abortion perspectives across the U.S. and what we've seen since the federal legalization of Roe v. Wade in 1973 is a fairly static arrangement of attitudes. We're still at about 1/5 of Americans who believe that abortion should be legal in no circumstances. We're at 1/5 to 1/4 of Americans who believe it should be legal in all circumstances, and then the other approximately 60% is along the bell curve somewhere in there. Now that bell curve slants a little more to the anti-abortion side. That is, that most people would agree that abortion should be restricted, and it's always a question of where, at least for the general populace, generally a question of where those lines should be drawn. The interesting thing, of course, is that the subject, the ostensible subject for my talk is not abortion per se, but fetal remains, fetal organ harvesting. And we're of course going to tie the two together because you must, but it's going to take a little bit of legwork to get there. So I want to start with the Center for Medical Progress videos and give you a little bit of background, because my presumption is that if you are staunchly opposed to abortion, you've watched at least some of the videos. And I also presume that if you're staunchly in favor of it, you probably haven't. The Center for Medical Progress, a nonprofit organized out in California a couple of years back, is a small operation run by David Daleiden and a couple associates, and no one should make any bones about it. It's an organization explicitly focused on exposing what CMP believes to be malpractice within the abortion industry. And we should also make no mistake in thinking that the abortion industry is in fact an industry. There are enormous business incentives at work in abortion in the United States and of course across the world. So late last summer, the Center for Medical Progress released about a dozen videos featuring Daleiden and one or another of his associates, typically under an alias, posing as representatives of a biomedical company, engaging with executives from Planned Parenthood to discuss the possibility of compensation for fetal remains. So, to my mind, there are 4 questions that the Center for Medical Progress videos raise that I want to go through. I know that there are significant doubts that many of you will have about the authenticity of the videos. We'll get there in a moment, but let's go through the allegations first. Here are the 4 central questions to my mind, the legal questions at issue. First, has Planned Parenthood illegally negotiated the sale price of fetal organs to to make a profit, not just to recover costs. That's first. Second, has it illegally altered the method of abortion not to benefit women's health, but to retrieve usable fetal tissue? Has it illegally failed to obtain the consent of women whose children's remains it harvested for parts for research? And fourth, and finally, is there evidence that under current law, Planned Parenthood is members of Planned Parenthood have actually committed murder? The answers to each of these, based on the evidence provided by the Center for Medical Progress videos, is a yes that needs to be further investigated, a yes that will certainly requires following up on, but at least prima facie, the answer to each of these questions is yes, and we'll go through them one by one. So, has Planned Parenthood illegally negotiated the sale price of fetal organs to make a profit, or to make a profit, not just to recover costs? Under current federal law, a law written by a Democrat, Henry Waxman, back in the 1990s, it is illegal to traffic in fetal organs for quote-unquote valuable consideration in the event that it affects interstate commerce. It's a law that was explicitly written to allow some room for interpretation, but the law is reasonably clear to an extent, and it has been adjudicated to a certain extent in the courts. So we have multiple examples from the CMP videos of Daleiden and his associate engaging with Planned Parenthood executives, in which the language they use seems to indicates, to my mind, very strongly that we're not just talking about recovering costs or donation for remuneration, which is the language that one Planned Parenthood executive uses, but that they're actually making money on the practice. I think that's the first set of evidence. The second set I'll get to momentarily, but let me quote from this is Deborah Vander High, National Director, Planned Parenthood's Consortium of Abortion Providers. We have independent colleagues who generate a fair amount of income doing this, and of course she's explicit on actually making sure there's no paper trail involved in this. It's an issue that you might imagine we're not really that comfortable talking about on email. That's in one video. Mary Gatter, who's the president of the Medical Directors Council for the Planned Parenthood Federation of America, is in a back and forth with Daleiden, or his associate. And this is the exchange. The buyer says, "Are we agreed that $100 would keep you happy?" Gatter, "Let me agree to find out what other affiliates in California are getting, and if they're getting substantially more, we can discuss it then. The money has to be big enough that it is worthwhile." And of course, the money quote from this is Gatter at the end of this segment saying, "Let me just figure out what others are getting. If this is in the ballpark, it's fine. If it's still low, then we can bump it up. I want a Lamborghini." This is if these videos are accurate, they suggest very strongly that higher-ups in the Planned Parenthood organization are seeking not simply to recover costs. If that were the aim, the language could be very, very different. And what it indicates is that they're making money on it. There are multiple investigations going on into the allegations that the CMP videos raise. And there are three currently going on concurrently in the House, one by the House Judiciary Committee, one by the House Committee for Government Oversight, and one by the Energy and Commerce Committee. And the selective panel that is operating in the Energy and Commerce Committee provided interesting information that shows that because of the way that organ harvesting is conducted as commerce, Planned Parenthood basically, or any abortion clinic that's engaged in this practice, basically has no overhead for engaging other than providing the time and the facility for the harvesting to take place. So here's how it works. A university, UCLA is a popular one, Harvard, etc., reaches out to a company like STEM Express. That's the central one at issue in the CMP videos. You can go to STEM Express's website. You can select the type of organ you want and approximately when in the what gestational stage you want that material, and then they, partnering with abortion providers, will go and they will procure that organ. There are obviously incentives at work here to make sure that those organs are obtained in ways that are going to be usable for research down the road. There are also incentives, perverse incentives to my mind, operating with the actual technicians who are paid not just a flat fee by the company for whom they're working, but are also typically paid paid per specimen, and the specimens are categorized so that, for example, harvesting a brain is worth more than harvesting certain other organs. To my mind, that creates a problematic incentive structure in this commercial arrangement, to say the least. But setting that aside, what you see in documents provided to the selected panel, which are available online, you can go and find them for yourself, is effectively that almost all of the cost of these procedures is taken by the research institution and then by the procurement agency. If that's correct, then effectively what you have is Planned Parenthood providing cost-free space and time, or any abortion provider providing cost-free space and time, and then seeking remuneration for it, which would in fact be a profit and which would in fact be against the law. That's the first allegation. The second, has any abortion provider illegally altered the method of abortion not to benefit women's health, but to retrieve usable fetal tissue for federally funded research. What is being described, manipulating the presentation of a child to obtain certain fetal remains is explicitly against federal and several state codes. Here's the federal code. No alteration of the timing, method, or procedures used to terminate the pregnancy may be made solely for the purposes of obtaining the tissue. That's the federal code as it stands today. All right. 2 quotes. Deborah Nucatola, Senior Director of Medical Services at Planned Parenthood Federation. So you're kind of cognizant of where you put your graspers. You try to intentionally go above and below the thorax so that, we've been very good at getting heart, lung, liver, because we know that. So I'm not going to crush that part. I'm going to basically crush below, I'm going to crush above, and I'm going to see if I can get it all intact. And with the calvarium, that's the head, some people will actually try to change the presentation so that it's not vertex, that is, it's not head first. Because when it's vertex presentation, you never have enough dilation at the beginning of the case. What she's describing is altering the procedure of an abortion in order to retrieve fetal tissue. Here's Mary Gatter, previously quoted, talking about her desired Lamborghini. Let me explain to you a little bit of a problem, which may not be a big problem. If our usual technique is suction at 10 to 12 weeks, and we switch to using a manual vacuum aspirator or something with less suction in order to increase the odds that it will come out as an intact specimen, then we're kind of violating the protocol that says to the patient, we're not doing anything different in our care for you. Now, to me, that's kind of a specious argument, and I wouldn't object to asking Ian, who's our surgeon who does the cases, to use a manual vacuum aspirator at that gestational stage in order to increase the odds that he's going to get an intact specimen. So there you have, again, 2 Planned Parenthood executives talking about how they're manipulating the procedure to obtain fetal tissue. The third question that the videos raise is, do they do so in violation of the contracts that they have with patients? Gatter just explained to you the type of contract that they have, which is we have a given procedure, the mother signs off, the abortion provider signs off. What Gatter is saying is that it's not at all out of the bounds of possible for someone like her or someone like at a clinic to discuss with the surgeon changing the procedure in violation of that contract. So there's something to be said, I think it's something important to be said, aside from the question of abortion, about the question in which an abortion provider, the way in which an abortion provider treats its patients as a matter of simple, straightforward contract law. The last, and to my mind the most important allegation is that of straightforward murder. And I'm not saying that to shock or to be that stereotypical person, but simply because there is a question under the law based on the CMP investigation. The 7th video released features Holly O'Donnell, who's a former STEM Express procurement technician. That is, she's one of the people who used to work for the biomedical company that would send representatives to abortion providers to actually obtain fetal tissue. And she describes an event at a Planned Parenthood in California. And I apologize that it's graphic. There it is, that's the nature of what we're talking about. A colleague calls O'Donnell over following an abortion and says, "I want you to see something cool. This is kind of neat." So I'm over here, it's O'Donnell, and the moment I see it, I'm flabbergasted. This is the most gestated fetus and the closest thing to a baby I've seen. And she's like, "Okay, I want to show you something." So she has one of her instruments, and she just taps the heart, and it starts beating. And I'm sitting here, and I'm looking at this fetus, and its heart is beating, and I don't know what to think. She's like, "Do you know why that's happening?" Here's the federal definition of a born alive infant: the complete expulsion or extraction from his or her mother of that member at any stage of development, who after such expulsion or extraction breathes or has a beating heart, pulsation of the umbilical cord, or definite movement of voluntary muscles, regardless of whether the umbilical cord has been cut, and regardless of whether the expulsion or extraction occurs as a result of natural or induced labor, cesarean section, or induced abortion. That's the federal law. And California law has a similar provision. So here's O'Donnell again. STEM Express wanted to procure a brain from this particular infant. It had a face. It wasn't completely torn up. Its nose was very pronounced. It had eyelids, and its mouth was pronounced. And then, since the fetus was so intact, she said, "Okay, this is a really good fetus, and it looks like we can procure a lot from it. We're going to procure a brain. So the moment I hear it, that means we're going to have to cut its head open." Okay, this is the technician. "So what you do is go through the face." She takes the scissors and she makes a small incision right here, showing under her chin, and goes a little bit through the mouth. She's like, "Okay, can you go the rest of the way?" And so she gave me the scissors and told me that I have to cut down the middle of the face. And that's what O'Donnell proceeds to do. Here's the California Penal Code for murder: the unlawful killing of a human being or a fetus with malice aforethought. If that accusation is true, it's a flat-out felony murder charge. It's the kind of allegation that, under normal circumstances, should prompt immediate investigation. Needless to say, that hasn't necessarily happened. Now, to my mind, we have at least tentative evidence that is happening, at least in a whole lot of Planned Parenthood clinics, abortion providers generally, is in violation of several laws. A lot of you doubt that prima facie because you doubt the validity of the videos. I had someone on the Facebook page for this event send a link to a New York Times article talking about how the videos have been that they had gone through technical analysis, and that analysis effectively showed that they were altered. Conveniently, that analysis was done by Fusion GPS, and I wrote about that analysis last year. And what the New York Times fails to mention is that, in fact, Fusion GPS's report, which was commissioned by Planned Parenthood, actually doesn't show significant alteration, doesn't show significant deception. I just want to go through a few of the allegations. So, for instance, there's a moment in one of the videos in which you can hear Planned Parenthood staff off camera saying a phrase that CMP claims is, "It's a boy." Now, Planned Parenthood objected to this, naturally, and this report checks it out. And again, it's the Planned Parenthood Commission report. Neither internal nor expert analysis found any artifacts of editing in or around this segment that would suggest the audio was inserted or manipulated using technical tools. Shortly after, there's another off-camera line, "Another boy." That's what CMP alleges the Planned Parenthood staff member in the room was saying. Again, here's the report. Neither internal nor external analysis found evidence that CMP inserted or manipulated this dialogue post hoc. Forensic expert Grant Fredericks, who's well known, he's an FBI consultant, he works with law enforcement agencies across the world, found the audio spectrum to be consistent and continuous before, during, and after this dialogue. Here's, one of the cheekier things that CMP did in creating these videos and then releasing them is, of course, they released a shortened version, which is the version that most people have seen. And they also released simultaneously full investigative footage. So if you actually watch, quote, all of the CMP videos, then you're actually in for something like 15, 18 hours of video, which is all available. Fusion GPS did its analysis before some of those videos were actually out, but Planned Parenthood and others were already objecting that they were deceptively edited. This was Fusion GPS's conclusion about the entire analysis. This analysis did not reveal widespread evidence of substantive video manipulation. And to a certain extent, that makes sense. Barring some sort of very, very clever technological insertion, it's impossible it would be otherwise impossible to get Mary Gatter saying it's a Lamborghini, or Deborah Nucatola saying that they're going to try a less crunchy, quote unquote, technique, or any of the other things that I've already quoted. There's a very reasonable case to be made that these things were in fact said, and the question becomes, okay, then what? So, if you'll indulge me that far, I said I'd be talking a little bit about abortion politics from this point on, sort of what happens in the wake of these videos. I think a couple things. One is there has not been significant movement in one direction or another because of the CMP videos, and there won't be. Part of that is because there was a very, very effective counter-campaign launched by Planned Parenthood and other other pro-abortion organizations. Part of it is because there was a clear and unmistakable blacklisting in the media. The video that I quoted from, in which Holly O'Donnell talks about cutting up the face of a born alive infant 24 hours afterward, couldn't be found on the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, CNN, ABC, and any other number of outlets, despite the fact that any other comparable allegation in a different circumstance, any other comparable homicide allegation would probably be A-section material. However, despite the fact that I think the general arrangement of abortion politics in the United States has remained largely static because of the videos, what you will see are small but important shifts. So one of those shifts is on the anti-abortion side. With the exception of Tuesday night's results, the exception of Donald Trump, because he is the exception to many things, it's effectively now a litmus test within the Republican Party that not only are you opposed to abortion, but you're also in favor of defunding Planned Parenthood. That would have been impossible without these videos. And there's basically no one within the larger Republican conference who's against that, and there were no Republican candidates, again, excising Trump, who disagreed with that proposal either. That's a very significant change. It doesn't indicate a harder movement in any direction, but it is crystallization, a sort of intensification of the issue among anti-abortion politicians. A similar hardening or calcification is happening among pro-abortion politicians. And this has been ongoing, I'd say, a little longer. But in 2012, the Democratic Party removed from its official party platform the language safe, legal, and rare to refer to abortion, which of course had been sort of the emblematic approach to abortion since Bill Clinton in the early 90s, that the Democratic Party wanted to be safe and legal, but also wanted to make strides to reduce the number of abortions. They've taken that language out. Hillary Clinton, the presumptive nominee on the Democratic side, has said that she's open to restrictions late in the third term, but hasn't actually indicated which, if any, restrictions on abortion she would be open to. Barbara Boxer, the senator from California, famously said in the 1990s, when asked about her abortion views, that it wasn't a baby until the mother took it home from the hospital, effectively endorsing legal infanticide, at least for a period under existing law. That polarization, that sort of hardened or intensified sentiment on both sides, is going to be the political ramification of these videos, barring whatever falls out again of ongoing investigations. But I still think, as someone who followed the story and wrote about it, that these videos are a touchstone. They're going to be an important moment in the arc of abortion politics in the United States. And that's for a very simple reason. It's one that was intuitive to everyone who watched them, which is that it highlighted the moral desensitization that is simply part and parcel of the abortion industry. So go back to Holly Donnell and what she had to do in the way that she describes it. There's an element of repugnance for most people hearing about that. There's an element of reflexive disgust. Repugnance is not always a surefire moral indicator, but it does usually grant us the germ of a moral insight. And so here we get to the Fava beans, half of my title, which is there's a moral anesthetization that seems to have happened in the abortion industry, that these videos revealed for a whole lot of people. When an executive can say, a lot of people want liver over her wine and salad, when someone can joke about how she's going to sell off fetal remains to help finance her luxury car, there's something that rises up, I think, in a lot of people. And I think that is a reaction and a moral impulse that should be heeded and not buried. This is the relation between fetal remains and abortion as such. Now, I want to sort of briefly make the case that we are working on a spectrum here. So there are a couple central objections to someone like me, or someone who thinks that abortion is morally wrong and should be legally prohibited to whatever extent. The first is that we're not dealing with a human being. Of course we're dealing with a human being. This is basic embryology. The question is, do we have a human being from the moment of fertilization, or do we have a human being somewhere further? There are two main objections to the idea that we don't have a human being at the moment of fertilization. One, that we have a human being only at the moment of implantation, which usually happens 6 days after fertilization, or that we don't have a human being until we pass the threshold for monozygotic twinning, which is where one zygote can become two. And in either case, the biology here is fairly straightforward, and all of these standard embryology texts agree that you have unitary organized movement in one direction from the moment of fertilization. If you follow a fertilized egg over those first 6 days of life, what you see is an ordered movement preparing for implantation. There's a sequence of events, a regular sequence of events that takes place preparing for this future moment. How is that happening unless you have a coherent individual organism that, of course, has different DNA than the mother? That's the first. The second is the twinning thesis ignores the fact that it ignores the logical objection that just because monozygotic twinning could happen at 14 days doesn't negate the fact that you could still have a human being before that, in the same way that a flatworm, adult flatworm, can split into two flatworms, but that doesn't mean you didn't have one live organism to begin with. That's the scientific parallel that's at stake there. If you acknowledge this, that you have a human being from the moment of fertilization, then the later term arguments that we're having are less consequential, although they do remain sort of the standards for thinking about abortion laws in the United States. So for instance, it's fairly well established that a fetus can experience pain at 20 weeks. So right now, sitting in the Senate, because it's been passed by the House, is the Pain Capable Unborn Child Act, which would be a federal ban on abortions after 20 weeks on the grounds that you shouldn't be permitted to abort an organism that can feel the pain of the actual procedure. And then there's the question of fetal viability, which is about 2 weeks later. The New England Journal of Medicine published last year a new study suggesting that we can bump up the usual threshold for viability to 22 weeks, which means that at the point of 22 weeks, that fetus can be outside the womb and with proper medical attention can survive. If you don't believe that what you have is a human being, very early on in gestation, then you still have, even if you don't believe that, you still have to make the case that fetal pain or fetal viability are not reasonable thresholds for thinking through the question of prohibitions on abortion. Now, if you accept that what we have is a human being, then perhaps you could argue that we have a human being, we don't have a person being the bearer of certain rights and deserved protections. What that means is that you have now created a class of human non-persons. A couple of questions seem to emerge from that. The first is, where does personhood come in? Does it come in when the child could feel pain? Is that the indication of a consciousness a consciousness capable of responding to pain? Is that the moment of personhood? Is it later than that? Is it earlier? What's the difference between a baby at 21 weeks, which we think isn't viable, and 23 weeks, which we think is? And to that extent, if you have a human being and a unitary track of movement from the moment of fertilization, that is, if from the moment of fertilization to natural death, there's not any turns in development, there's simply an unfolding, then it's reasonable to ask what the difference is between a child 5 minutes before birth, 5 minutes after birth. Secondly, the category of human non-persons raises other questions. For example, who else might qualify? The category of human non-persons is what's opened the door to questions of end-of-life care and whether, for instance, irreversibly, quote-unquote, comatose patients are human any longer, if they deserve the protections of the law. I think this opens the door to significant moral quandaries and unnecessary ones and frankly dangerous ones. I've made the argument, and I know others have made the argument, Hadley Arcus, for instance, has made the argument that the category of human non-persons sounds a whole lot like a justification for slavery that was used in the antebellum period. Conceptually, I think it's very hard to deny that there's any particular difference. In sum, you have here a question of the cheapness or the value of life. The 20th century proved that life can become very, very cheap. And if we are to protect that, it seems like the obvious way is to acknowledge the intrinsic dignity of a human person from the moment of fertilization. It's important to value human beings as a kind of entity. They're valuable because they're human, because they have a human, rational nature that exists from the moment of conception, as opposed to valuing a human being only because of something contingent that might or might not happen later in the process of development, which again raises all of these very troubling questions. This is, to my mind, important for sustaining a liberal democratic order. Again, if the class of human non-persons could extend reasonably once you open those gates, if that class could extend to individuals of, who knows, other races like it used to, other sexual orientations, whatever the case may be. If you open that category and make the evaluation of a person's life contingent upon attributes that they may or may not have, you've fundamentally undermined the premises of a liberal democratic order by showing that, in fact, it's not a self-evident truth that all men are created equal. They're not endowed by their Creator with life, liberty, or the pursuit of happiness. Lastly, the right to life is the language that we speak in. It's a valuable language. I think it's true. But, and this is, I think, important for the politics going forward, rights talk is built into the American fabric. It's right there in our founding documents. It's all throughout our jurisprudence. We talk in terms of rights. I'm sure some of you are going to ask me about women's right to choose. For those who are engaged in this fight on either side, I think what's equally important is balancing rights talk with a vocabulary, a more classical vocabulary of virtues, of common good, of goods that we're seeking, and of the moral imagination that's requisite to achieve those goods. Of saying that rights are very hard-edged things. It's moral imagination. It's that sort of organic act of heart and mind, less than the conceptual abstractions of rights that allow us to bridge the gap to one another, to actually live in a community where, while we might have contrasting views of rights, we still engage in a community seeking a larger, a broader, and a better end. That's a message that I think is very important for people against abortion, who often become very shrill. And it's a message that's extremely important to those who do support abortion, who have the same shortcoming. So that's what I have for this evening. I hope that it raised a couple thoughts, and I'm sure it raised more than a few questions. So at that, I'm welcome to take your questions, denunciations, condemnations, anything. I'll give Zach the supervisor's privilege.
Thank you for being here with us today. For the audience, could you clarify what precisely is your stance on the issue of abortion? And are there any conditions under which you would revise the stance that you're committed to?
My personal stance?
Yes, your personal stance.
Yeah, my personal stance is I'm against abortion in all circumstances, period, across the board. I don't see room for exceptions, including rape, incest. The life of the mother is a case that offers, I think, very, very difficult decisions, but also one that does allow moral clarity that permits a different option than abortion as it's understood either under the law or in different philosophical circles. So that's where I stand. Would I revise that if you can convince me that you don't have a human being or a person until a certain moment in gestation or until birth or whatever the case may be? Sure. see if I can work that out.
Yeah, so to follow up on that, I actually also believe that life starts the moment of conception, but I'm also pro-choice, and I know that might sound very confusing. So based on those personal views, and thank you so much for coming, because I don't really get to call into Fox News and ask Bill O'Reilly what his response to my questions would be.
You wouldn't.
So obviously, it's part of like what Planned Parenthood videos have done is rile up this politics of abortion, and obviously a lot of states in the South especially have passed legislation that limits access to abortion. So I'm wondering what you would tell a 13-year-old girl who was gang raped and essentially sentenced to parenthood without any sort of support. And if your response to that is that that's the exception, then also the fact that Planned Parenthood services only 3% of it are abortion services, so in that regard, Planned Parenthood should actually not be involved in conversations of being defunded. So I'm wondering how you would respond.
Well, you have a couple different issues there. First of all, let me address the easier one, which is Planned Parenthood funding. Planned Parenthood received in 2013, 2014, the most recent year for which we have financial documents. Planned Parenthood received $528.4 million from the federal government, which is 41% of its revenue stream. That's a significant chunk of change, and of course it exists under the Hyde Amendment, which is a rider that's existed on appropriations bills since the 70s, named after the Ohio representative who first offered it, which prohibits the use of federal taxpayer dollars toward abortion. Of course, the rule of economics 101 is that money is fungible, and so basically the Hyde Amendment, with which I agree because it's generally a conscience protection law. But what the Hyde Amendment is premised on is basically that Planned Parenthood receives a stack of dollar bills amounting to $528.4 million, and then it puts them in a closet, and then it doesn't touch any of that money for abortion. That's basically what the Hyde Amendment requires for Planned Parenthood to actually follow the law. In fact, what of course happens is Planned Parenthood just receives $528.4 million that they can use for overhead, for staffing, for et cetera. And so it's just indirectly funding abortion. To the question of 3%, there's very reliable evidence that it's much higher than that. Of course, it's interesting that since 2009, Planned Parenthood's cancer screenings have actually been cut in half. And yet, they're making more revenue, they're making a greater profit, $127 million in 2014, and they're receiving larger amounts of federal funding. Yet, the cancer screenings and one other major aspect of their business model have actually been cut in half since 2009. So, just for what that's worth. And again, I'm not making a case explicitly against Planned Parenthood. They're the largest abortion provider in the world, and they're responsible for 330,000 abortions last year. But there are 1 million abortions in the United States annually, so there are a whole lot of other people to whom I'm opposed as well. Planned Parenthood just happens to be the JP Morgan of their industry. To your second question, to your first question, but the one that obviously is far more difficult, which is the situation in which someone is raped. Again, you have to, so let me answer by way of a couple things. First of all, you have to accept, or you have to acknowledge one way or the other whether you think there's a human person at stake. Okay, so the rape has been committed, there's been conception. Is there a human being at stake or not? Is there a human being with a claim on life? I would say yes, there is. for the reasons that I've cited. Namely, the embryology suggests that, and namely that if you open up a category of human non-persons, then you open up a whole lot of other problems. If you do say that there is a human being in there who deserves some protection over their life, then you have a moral calculus to make, which is, A, does that being in there deserve equal protection to, one of you, right? One of you in the audience, right? Does a human embryo, 4 days old, for instance, merit the same protections as a 22-year-old Williams University student? There's debate about that in pro-life circles. I would say that they deserve the utmost protection that you can possibly give them. They do have a striking moral claim. Now, you've complicated the issue by talking about a minor. It's one thing it complicates the issue because it brings into it parental consent, parental notification, a whole lot of other things that make the moral calculus more difficult. My stance is that because that child is a person, because they're a human being, just in a different form, in the same way that an infant is in a different form than a teenager, they deserve the protection of the law. They shouldn't be killed. Additionally, because the cost of ending that life is total and irreversible compared to the costs that will be borne horribly, tragically, by the mother. Those costs are at least mitigable to a certain extent. The situation you've raised is a hard one, and I'm not denying that, and I don't think anybody would. But you can make a clear moral case for maintaining the life of that child, despite the horrific circumstances in which it's come to be. Another thing, and I would just add this, the exceptions that people get very, very riled up about, rape, incest, and danger to the life of the mother, constitute 3% of abortions in the United States. I am very, very happy to talk about exceptions under the law to those 3% of abortions if you're willing to concede the other 97%. That's a conversation that we're not having in public. Why not? You've gone straight to the hardest possible case, right? Which is great. And it raises important moral and philosophical questions, but as a matter of public policy, I'm willing to concede that that's a very difficult case and that maybe the law should have some flexibility because of the distress that that's going to put on the mother, on all those involved in that situation. But I'd also like for those who raise that as some sort of clincher on the abortion question to acknowledge that's 0.001% of all cases, and that if you'll bend on public policy for a whole lot more, then we could have a reasonable conversation to that end. You have signs, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm wondering what you're doing and what the United States government should do to help prevent women from needing abortions in the first place.
Sure. So there are a couple different things. I apologize for being terribly simple-minded, but you could not have sex. That would be one thing. there is a school of thought in some feminist literature that says that basically all sex is non-voluntary, all sex is rape.
Ooh, now you're offended.
Hold on. I think that a reasonable person would say that that's a very hard logical road to hoe. But let's start there. On the question of contraception, which I assume is part of what you're getting at, there are a couple of different angles worth taking. One is there's not terribly credible evidence that contraception cuts down the rate of abortion, and part of that's because there's risk compensation. Michael Jr. has written extensively about this, that people who think they're on reliable contraception make riskier decisions. Same thing that happens with drivers who have insurance versus drivers who don't. So if you look at programs, in states like Colorado ran a contraception program in 2014. They finally did the results in 2014. And what you actually found is that Colorado, where the program was running, where the state was engaging in actually promoting long-acting reversible contraception to women, the rate increased by about 5%. And that Colorado's actual abortion rate, as is true nationally, has been going down for several years, and the contraception outreach basically bumped it up marginally. I can give you the page if you like. I have it right here. To that extent, contraception is a different, to my mind, a different moral question than abortion. So it's not worth getting into on that stretch, but it's wildly available, cheap to free. There are 375 different locations within 10 blocks of my office in Manhattan where you can get contraception for free. I'm happy to debate things that the government can do on a marginal level to improve this question, but ultimately the best evidence that we have is that it's not going to be a solution that comes from government. Although I should add that when abortion laws are enacted in states, there are fewer abortions, which makes a certain amount of sense. Now, we can talk about the morality of that, but what you see is a significant rise. Even Cosmopolitan magazine had a breathless article late last year noting that since restrictions on abortion had gone into place in Texas, there had been many fewer abortions and more babies born. You had your hand up, ma'am?
So I am actually adopted, and my biological mother actually tried to abort me 3 times. So just giving you some context.
Sure.
So if your premise is that essentially all of these babies would be born and then put into, say, an adoption system, what is your guarantee that these children don't, suffer from high rates of, depression, other issues that most children who go into foster homes and are passed around and actually have extremely poor quality of life? Your stance seems to be that, this life should be cherished and protected with the utmost amount of rights. But once the baby is born, it seems like a lot of people who are anti-abortion are nowhere to be found.
Sure. So first of all, I would say that there have been significant strides among people opposed to abortion to adopt public policies that do help unwed, single mothers raising children, children living in families below the poverty level. I'm happy to cite some of them for you and direct you to that information. off the government away from the government side. The question of adoption is an entirely valid one. I had someone raise this with me a couple weeks ago who had been in a very similar circumstance. My position is fairly simple, which is that which I apologize for being glib, but that life is better than death, and that a quality of life decision, again, is right at the border of opening you up to the problem of a human non-person. At what point is this life not worth protecting? At which point is this life not valuable within our society? I don't think I have to spell out the problematic consequences that type of ethic raises. The second, relatedly, it raises the question of who makes that decision. In this case, we have a fairly obvious authority, and that would be the mother of that child. But if you open up the question of quality of life, then you also distribute that authority to people who might not at all be suited to handle it, or might be ready to abuse it, which is what you see in end-of-life decisions being made all across Europe. And that's, again, a slightly different but related situation. So while I'm entirely sympathetic to the difficulties that someone who goes through the foster system may suffer over the course of their life, I think that it's an absolute good for them to be alive, and that if we can accept that, then we can talk about all the different sorts of things that we can do to make those lives flourish. That should
You didn't
absolutely
name any of the things that would make their lives flourish, because you're not helping them flourish. You're putting them in a system that they might never get out of.
Okay, then we could reform that system. But this avoids the moral question at stake, which is a quality of life decision a valid decision to make when it comes to ending a life? I don't think it is.
I'm sorry, you're totally ignoring the amount of people who commit suicide because they believe that death is in fact better than life, and that quality of life is the only thing that's at stake in their own lives.
And I think they're wrong. Look, I think that suicide is a horrible thing for anyone to be driven to by any sort of circumstance. But I think that ultimately it's out of a confusion, not any sort of moral insight, and that a community, any responsible culture, and any responsible community would steer people away from thinking of death as any sort of escape, or death as death as in any way an improvement over life. At the top.
Okay. So, firstly, before I ask a question, I saw one poster down there which I want to say a thought to. The poster said, if you believe that life begins at conception, drop your omelet. I would just like to point out that pretty much every single egg in America isn't fertilizing meat. To my question, I am actually okay with having the idea of a non-person human. After all, every single embryo isn't given constitutional rights, as one candidate in the first GOP debate tried to imply. So it seems like there's an inherent logic flaw there, in that they're saying that this here is a person, but we aren't giving them constitutional rights. But also, to another point you raised, the fact that when you do increase the rates of, when you do ban abortion, the rate of abortion goes down. I'd also like to point out that when you ban abortion, the rate of illegal abortions, which are inherently dangerous, does go up.
So, to the first point, it's entirely a matter of historical contingency, which human non-persons don't have constitutional rights. For 100 years that was blacks in America. And for longer it was women, at least when it came to the vote. That avoids the moral question by slipping behind a historical fact, which is entirely contingent. There might in fact be a day when embryos do receive constitutional protection in the United States. And the question is whether that's the right thing to do or not. And as I've tried to argue that to some extent, I do think it is. Now, to the second question, which is that rates of illegal abortion go up. Yes, that's true. There's not good evidence to confirm to what extent they go up. The evidence coming out of some people have cited Texas as an example of an increase in self-induced abortions since they passed their abortion restrictions. The evidence actually doesn't match up, in part because they didn't look at before or after statistics. There's just a whole lot of credible evidence to quantify the extent. I'm not saying that it doesn't happen; it does. But again, there is indeed another moral question at the root of this, which is, as a society, if we agree that life is an absolute good, then we're always going to be making trade-offs. We're always going to be evaluating benefits over costs. Here we have a question of, is the benefit of, in this hypothetical situation, right, of reducing the number of abortions by prohibiting the procedure to whatever extent, is that a net benefit? Is that a moral benefit, given what we know is going to happen? From a logical perspective, yes, because practically we can say that illegal or self-induced abortions will increase. Logically, though, that doesn't follow from simply outlawing abortions. And secondly, as a matter of practice, I would say that yes, it does, because there are things that we can do still to aid those who find themselves in the position that they think a self-induced abortion is the only resolution to the situation in which they find themselves.